Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session for today before our closing remarks of the C3EB Summit, or the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit, the February edition. And we have a wonderful speaker on stage. And just a heads up, I do have to say that we did have some technical difficulties getting the slides up because of some browser issues and a few other tech stuff that I'm not able to see. So our speaker is not only our last speaker, but they are going to be winging it with the slides on their end and explaining everything to us. So it is going to be extra engaging and challenging and interesting and inspiring for all of us to learn from. Before I introduce our speaker, quick housekeeping notes. As usual, all of you know this by this point. If you need auto transcription, we invite you to go to www.facebook.com/C3EB Summit. Auto transcription has been enabled there. So whether you or anybody that you know might need closed captioning, this session is available live right now on facebook.com with closed captioning. With that being said, it is my absolute honor and pleasure and privilege to end this summit with a dear friend of mine and a dear colleague and somebody that I respect and admire so deeply, Shaun Wanzo, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, educator, and trainer at Conduit LLC. Before I hand the stage off to Shaun, I just want to say a quick bio about Shaun. Shaun's path to becoming a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and trainer included working on campaigns dismantling systemic racism, inequities, and disparities associated with race, gender, and class. He lobbied, organized, and spoke for social justice and criminal reform while working with the ACLU, Just Leadership, and several other organizations. As a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and trainer, Shaun advocates for members of the BIPOC, or BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, People of Color community, as well as other historically marginalized groups. Past partners and clients have included Wash Hero, Generator, AMFM Corporate and Social Impact Institute, Northwestern Mutual's Product Brew, Focus Training, and the Milkway Tech Hub. Shaun also trains founders, CEOs, and others from different sectors of the marketplace in one-on-one sessions. With all of that, again, it is my absolute privilege and honor and pleasure to welcome Shaun Wanzo to the C3EB platform and stage. Shaun, the stage is yours. Take it away, my friend.
Hello, everybody. Bear with me. I practiced this presentation with my slides, so I'm going to do my best to, as my dear friend AJ, informed you already, I'm going to do my best to wing it. She gave you my introduction. And I appreciate that because that's going to save time. That was part of my original presentation. Well, basically, my presentation is on the financial equity gap. And more specifically, it's about how systemic racism perpetuates, or has perpetuated the financial equity gap disproportionately for historically marginalized groups. And I know I'm pretty much preaching to the crowd. Even though I'm the last presenter, I'm definitely not the best. It's been a bunch of wonderful presenters before me. I've learned a lot. And immediately even, used what I learned from some of them to tailor my presentation. So I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, about the historically marginalized groups, but some more specifically that I'll be talking about today, as AJ mentioned already, are the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities. I believe the more politically correct term is perfectly abled, people with cognitive and physical disabilities, veterans, and formerly incarcerated just as impacted individuals. And so when you look at how systemic racism has widened the financial equity gap for these historically marginalized groups, there's definitely an intersection, amongst all of them, as far as the disparities and inequities that have disproportionately affected them. But there's also besides the commonalities and universal inequities, there's some specific things that have, because of how systemic racism was systematically designed, there are some inequities that, affect them, individually, the members of the different communities. So the majority of this presentation, the majority of it is going to be about the BIPOC community, more specifically Black and Brown communities, because when you look at systemic racism and you look at key metrics like the median income household, Black and Brown communities, unfortunately, are on the lower part of the totem pole, the bottom rung in the ladder. But when you look at some of the other historically marginalized groups, as I was doing this research, and not just for this presentation, when I do my work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, some key numbers and statistics, always have popped out at me. So when you look at, beginning with the LGBTQ community, it's widely known some of the things that have disproportionately affected them, that affect wealth, things like marriage and, health coverage. When it comes to health insurance, just being able to be covered. And that's, for the LGBTQ community overall. But when you look at more specifically, when you break down the numbers and the data even further, when you look at people people who are also members of the BIPOC community that also identify in one of the categories or subgroups of the LGBTQ community plus community, it gets the data points at even more marginalization and disenfranchisement. More specifically, like when going back to healthcare coverage, like 20 people of color who also identify as LGBTQ plus, unfortunately, nearly 20%, I think it's 19.1 to be exact, have a higher rate of diabetes and other health ailments because they are, amongst the LGBTQ community plus community overall, and compared to the unemployment rate, amongst, all groups in this country, they're 4 times more unemployed. So there's a direct correlation and connection between, them having a higher rate of diabetes and other health elements. And then when you look at a group like, the perfectly able, people with cognitive and physical disabilities, nearly 20%, of all people in this country identify as having either a cognitive disability and a physical disability. But then when you look at most organizations and corporations, they're not properly equipped, what's termed as accessibility, to provide the proper tools and resources, for these individuals to be successful, in workplace, the educational space, and other things. So that, obviously is going to perpetuate, more inequities, people not having the things they need to be successful, and not only be successful at their job, but just feel included, feel appreciated and feel accepted, and not just merely tolerated, checking a box or a quota. Then when you look at a group like the formerly incarcerated, now, even though I'm currently located in Tucson, I spent the majority of my adult life, outside of the chunk of time that I spent in Southern California and the state of Washington, the majority of my life, and particularly my adult life, was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So even though I'm about to, quote numbers and cite data that's specific to Wisconsin, it's across the board, across the country. When you look at mass incarceration, the unemployment rate amongst people with criminal backgrounds is nearly 30%, 27% to be exact. And in the state of Wisconsin, if you crunch the data, it costs almost $40,000 per year to house individuals, and just, us being a society that's supposed to, provide second chances and take care of our own, even if it doesn't pull at your heartstrings, it just makes sense mathematically, to want to make sure that a person, that's returning to the community has the resources that they need, particularly housing, employment, and be able to address their mental health and physical needs, because it affects us physically, not only state by state, but nationwide. And it constantly perpetuates mass incarceration. And it just, the cyclical nature of systemic racism just continues and perpetuates itself. And the last group I'll highlight, but definitely not least, is veterans. The number that really stuck out at me, when I was doing this, research for this presentation, and wanted to highlight this marginalized group and why they're, the disproportionately affected by the, and not able to attain financial equity, is 20 people per day, 20 veterans per day commit suicide. 40,000 are currently homeless. And I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, as I've never served in any of the armed branches, but I have a lot of family that have. My niece and her fiance are currently, stationed in Germany. Will be back in a few weeks. And I thought about them, and I thought about like the promises made to them. I don't know about all the programs and all the bills, but I have heard of the GI Bill and just other resources that are supposed to be available to them, once, their service ends. So I just don't understand. I'm confused at like, how do 40,000 veterans end up homeless, when there's supposed to be these programs and, things in place, for them to, transition into, what's called the civilian community. So, I want to highlight those marginalized groups. And I also want to, before I move into, median, a metric like median household income and how Black and brown communities have been disproportionately affected, when it comes to trying to attain financial equity. I want to acknowledge, as a guy that grew up, born in Milwaukee, grew up in San Diego, even though the majority of the communities I lived in were, of Black and brown people, they were definitely, I grew up amongst, whether in my community or right on the outside, the edges of the border. I grew up around a lot of Asians, Pacific Islanders, members of the Middle Eastern community, the Indian community, which is also under the Asian category. And I wanted to acknowledge that even though the data that I ran across highlights how they have ascended, their median household income has ascended, especially for those that have attained, degrees post high school, bachelor's, master's, PhD, so out of all the different, I don't like that word minority, but out of all the different BIPOC community members, the Asian community is the community that I noticed that their median household income has spiked. But I'm talking through my own lived experience and my lens, there's definitely many Asian communities and many communities with, whether in the Middle Eastern, populations and members that are economically depressed too. There are no absolutes, except in mathematics. So I just want to acknowledge that, because I don't want to make it seem like it's just all rosy on that end, but when you look at a key metric like, and ironically, I couldn't upload my slide deck, but so by the 2018 data, Black and brown communies, when it comes to that key metric of median household income, were on the bottom ladder, like they had barely, like if they mirror each other, like the Hispanic or, slash Latinx community, excuse me, I'm kind of a dinosaur. I'm still using Latino. I hope no one is taking offense, but they pretty much mirror each other. And ironically, I was going to use, until I saw the year and saw how old the data was, I was going to use a slide from 2004. I had initially uploaded that slide. And when I noticed that, I was like, oh, this is old data. I got to find another slide. So I found another slide that was, where there's a 14-year gap. But I'm gonna be like, man, when it comes to Black and brown communities, like, even with a decade and a half, nearly 15 years had passed, like there was barely a blip. If you think about a heart monitor, there was barely like a blip, on the radar as far as, or barely a spike as far as that key median household median household metric, when it comes to standard of living. So, so like, so when it comes to systemic racism, and how historically marginalized groups, I just wanted to highlight how there's this intersection, of, disparities and inequities, but there's definitely, when it comes to the Black and brown community, they have been disproportionately affected when it comes to the financial equity gap. But these other historically marginalized groups, there's the intersection, and then they have, like basically their own, disparities and inequities that have widened the gap, so to say, in comparison to white communities. And another slide I want to highlight before I talk about how the different systems, when you talk about systemic racism, how everything is connected, is another interesting graph that I had read across that, I'm gonna be honest with you, it really, being a guy that identifies as a Black and Latinx male, it shocked me, it surprised me. It was a graph that talked about median household income or median income amongst members of different communities, it pertaining to whether they have degrees post high school versus not. And it was shocking, when you look at the white community, bachelor's, master, post high school degrees, the median income was nearly $400,000. And then even for the members of the white community that don't have any post high school degrees, it was nearly $100,000. Median income, no degree post high school. Maybe there's some kind of skills obtained, but yeah, that's what the data says. And that graph was citing data as recently as 2017. So that was nearly, it's just barely over three years ago. But when you look at Black and brown communities, even those with post high school degrees were barely, it was like between 50, 60,000. That was the median income for individuals with post high school degrees. So that more, I hesitate to use the word conservative, but for those who disagree with me and some members of the, the audience that do the same work, that the ideology or the theory, like, oh, just get more education. That's, that'll fix your problem. Oh, the bachelor's degree didn't do it. Go get a master's degree, or go get a PhD. The data says that, when it comes to financial equity, like there's still a huge gap, even amongst those that have post high school degrees. And something that we all know, that's something that's been in the news and, different candidates have run on, is about, because more members of the Black and brown particularly, but of the BIPOC community that do obtain these degrees, they have, because of the communities that they come from, and other inequities and disparities when it comes to financial equity, it all ties back to it. They usually have to take out more loans. So even though they have these degrees, they have more college debt. So beyond that, so when it comes to moving on to specifically systemic racism, I've talked about this before, and I've given presentations on this, and a common theme, feedback that I hear is, especially those of, a higher consciousness, when it comes to social justice, at least, even they have told me, like a lot of the data, and a lot of the information that you provided to, through your training or presentation is stuff I knew, but I never thought about how it's all connected. So when you look at different systems, and there's a lot of different systems, there's the educational system, there's the healthcare system, there's the criminal justice system, transportation system, the financial institution system, public health, on and on and on. So when you look at the data says, and just off lived experience, so it definitely is, my perception is definitely involved in this, and maybe some biases, but at the same time, the data also points when it comes to financial equity. When you look at Black and brown economically depressed communities, you have to start with, and I'm going to go back to Milwaukee, and this is universal. So like, even though I'm using Milwaukee, Wisconsin as the proxy and just, trying to paint a picture, especially since I don't have any slides, just give you, make it more vivid. So when you look at Black and brown communities in Milwaukee, the first thing to measure, financial health, when you look at a community, it's going to be resources. That's the ultimate metric. And it would have to start going back to that median household income. That key metric, there has to be an income, so then when you look at the community and you see that the communities, there are no livable wage jobs. Excuse me for stuttering, but there's hardly any livable wage jobs in the immediate area, and in relation to the majority of the members of those communities' skill sets, it's 9 times out of 10, they're going to be searching for manufacturing jobs. And most of the manufacturing jobs, in Milwaukee would be in the suburban communities, borderlining Milwaukee County, which if you have a car, we're talking about like not even barely between a 10, 15-minute ride. But remember, most members of these communities are living at or below the poverty level. So dependable transportation is a problem. So they're depending on public transportation. So there's only a few bus lines that, will take them out to these, jobs that are paying a livable wage. But guess what? There's only a couple of them. And they were, right before I moved to Tucson, they had cut out one, that was going to one suburban community where there were a lot of, livable manufacturing jobs that pay livable wages. And they were debating on cutting another one off, so, and I mean, there was meetings and protests about it. So what happens when the very few opportunities to make a livable wage is cut off? Well, obviously, so now we're talking about transportation. Let's move to the criminal justice system and how mass incarceration is perpetuated. Well, if there are hardly any resources in the area and you're cutting off my opportunity to go make a livable wage, what am I going to do to survive? What am I going to do to feed my family? What am I going to do for some form of income or just basic necessities? So I mean, obviously, like, you definitely can't compare a third world country across the board, because we all know that, well, I'm not going to get into comparison, oppression Olympics, but just like in a third world country, when there's resources, violence and crime is going to spike. People need to survive. And when there's no other tools or resources to survive, unfortunately, the law gets broken. So then the crime rate goes up, more people get incarcerated, and then the inequities and disparities within the criminal justice system kick in, because these are already, most of the people are poor, so they can't afford proper representation. So they're stuck with public defenders who are overworked and overbooked. The best thing you can hope for is a plea deal. But whatever your outcome is, more than likely, by the data, you're coming back out, into the same community, now with a bigger target on your back because you have a felony or misdemeanor. So the cycle continues. Now, we talked about transportation. We talked about employment. We talked about the criminal justice system. Now, let's go take it back to the community where, how I stated what I stated in the first place, with a lack of resources, a lack of livable wage paying jobs. How is the educational system funded? The educational system is funded by taxes, more specifically, property values that are attached to taxes. But guess what? The property values in economically depressed areas are going to be much lower due to crime and other metrics that they use. So that means less money or less funding going into the educational system. And when you contrast that with the public school system in areas where the property values are higher, and you compare their schools and the programs and the classes that they offer, that means 9 times out of 10, public schools in economically depressed areas are not going to have information science technology classes. They're not going to have a lot of AP classes. They're not going to have a lot of arts classes or arts programs, which by the data has proven to promote spatial learning, and more specifically, just promote, being able to think outside the box and, be creative, skills that are really valued in pretty much every sector of the marketplace now. You're stripping schools of this. And then beyond that, classes like home economics, vocational classes for those that don't want to go to college, that want to go into construction trades or, a skill within the manufacturing sector. They can't, they're placed at a disadvantage, because they don't have these programs in high school. And, their counterparts that are coming from suburban schools are getting this type of education. So even for those that make it out of economically depressed communities that make it to college and they start, choosing their degree track, a lot of this information is new to them. It's just being presented to them where, kids that come from suburban communities have been, in some cases, have been introduced to that information as early as junior high school, so that puts them more on a track of success. When it comes to, and so now, I explained the cyclical nature of systemic racism, and explain there's definitely other systems, particularly the healthcare system, but that goes without saying. If you don't have a job and you don't have a high income coming in, you're not going to be able to afford a quality healthcare program or policy or whatever. So without quality healthcare, that there's no wonder and this is not me, by the data in Black and brown communities, higher cholesterol, high blood pressure, and think diabetes, is much more rampant and is diagnosed at a higher level in communities like that, especially when you want to break it down and talk about food deserts, because there's not a lot of quality grocery stores, or stores that promote, health, within those communities. And even if there was, a Whole Foods or any other store like it within those communities, they can't afford that, those high prices anyway, because of lack of income. So it's, it's all cyclical, and that's how these disparities and inequities keep getting perpetuated. And the only way to attack them is to come up with innovative measures. There's definitely been, some incremental progress, but we're still, a lot of these issues, were being fought against, during the civil rights era. So obviously we can't keep doing the same things, to eradicate a problem that, a lot of great leaders have already died for, trying to change the way things were going or the way things are now. So, some of the things that I was thinking about, like there definitely has to be, it's kind of a two-pronged attack. You definitely have to educate, children. There needs to be financial education, as early as grade school, mock portfolios, bank accounts set up so they can get introduced to this information at a young age and be mentored and tutored on that as they go through school. So it's impressed upon them how important it is. And so it becomes normal, it's a normal part of the curriculum. And it has to be a combination of, engaging them, about these things through a tech platform, through in class, learning and teaching and a curriculum set in place, make financial, mentors and tutoring and things of that nature. And then just as a collective, we should be engaging or pushing financial institutions to provide this type of education. So, I definitely don't, those are just some of my suggestions. At the end of this presentation, I encourage you to, if you have any thoughts or ideas, please drop them in the chat. And the last thing that I propose is that, there be, across the country, there be a coalition formed of, going, in relation to, this platform and this conference is, culturally competent leaders from all sectors of the marketplace, including the financial industry. There should compose these coalitions that are allowed to engage, councils and school boards across this country, to construct frameworks, innovative frameworks that break this cycle. I mean, no performative stuff, no symbolic gestures. There really needs to be, entirely different frameworks and curriculums developed by culturally competent leaders across all sectors of the marketplace, especially the financial industry. So with that said, that's the end of my presentation. If you would like, you can reach out to me, on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much on all platforms. Conduit, just, how it sounds. ConduitLLC.com is my website. Shaun@conduitllc.com is my email. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, both a personal account, and then I have my business account, Conduit LLC. And I thank you for your time.
Shaun, that was amazing. That was so amazing, and the chat has been blowing up, and then I've been on messages and DMs on how the conversational nature of this, without the slide deck, actually made it more conversational and more digestible and less lectury. And I think that's so important, right? Like you've taught us a lesson on improv, because you did it so well, on sort of going with the flow and working with whatever you got, no matter what technical difficulties, and really just how to make these seemingly heavy pieces, again, digestible. So thank you for that. I mean, so like literally, like the chat, there's so many comments. Leslie went, yep, systemic racism in education and employment, SMH, shake my head. Faustina said, frightening stats. Educational elitism is a real thing too. There are other pathways to success. And then they spoke about taking out extra loans to having to help the family. And then Leslie said, we don't have the generational wealth passed down. Most of us have to start from zero or negative. And then Shay said, I know many people, including me, that had to take out extra loans to pay for the cost of living while in college. More comments. Corrales said, again, lots of comments, but I think this comment with Corrales is definitely important, Shaun, especially because you do participate in some of the Asian unity rooms that I'm a part of, and thankfully you're a part of as well. Corrales said, absolutely, Dr. AJ, Shaun's presentation here should be spoken in the Asian creator rooms and Asian Instagram influencers rooms on Clubhouse. They need to hear a lot more of this. Thank you for dropping the science here, Shaun. And based on everything that you said, we are creating a whole series of Clubhouse rooms. And I think the overall consensus is you've given us so much knowledge that every single topic you've brought up deserves its own conversation and its own in-depth analysis and discussion. Shay said, I agree with financial education starting financial education early. Financial education is provided by many financial institutions, but many still don't trust them. Plus, there is a real stigma around money and outside communities educating them. Faustina said, great job, Shaun. Shay said, great information and presentation. Corrales said, great stuff. So really, this has been and you started off so humble by saying, like, Oh, I learned from everyone else, and you just knocked it out of the park, and you took us home as the last presentation. Um, I have so many questions, but I almost want to keep them for the clubhouse room tonight so that we can have a greater conversation about this, in a much more conversational manner where we can actually hear each other rather than me having to relay text to you. I think that's gonna be a much better use of our time. So let me ask you this as kind of like a closing thought before we start our clubhouse room tonight, before I close out the summit and then we start our clubhouse room at 8:30 tonight, is you and I both know that these problems are so interconnected, right? And you and I both know the data behind it. You and I both know exactly where people are showing up and doing the work and exactly where they're being performative. And I want to speak, I was wondering if you could address more of that performativeness based on your experiences. How do we actually inspire and motivate people to go down for to go deeper than just performative into intention? Because there's times, and you and I've had conversations about this. There's times when we can present this data in every which way we can until we're blue in the face, and sometimes it's like people just don't get it, and they still kind of they do the performative stuff, and it's like it goes back to the checking of the boxes, right? They do the bare minimum that they think is a bare minimum, and they're like, yeah, we're done. But it's like, no. So how do we inspire people to realize this is an ongoing movement and that this is not a one-time thing? This is small things we do every single day.
I think, and this might not be answering the question, at least directly, but it has to be made real for people. Like you have to, because unfortunately, just as humans, it's almost like some kind of innate characteristic that I think we all have to a certain degree. Depending on your lived experience and what background you come from, and just what you've been through in life, is that like things just aren't real till it's right on your front doorstep. So finding things within, different communities that you can connect to the overall problem. Like, listen, you might not have this going on in your community. You might not be dealing with this, but this is what you're dealing with. And this is where it comes from. So if you don't want, whether it's your children, your mother, your brothers, whoever you care about, if you don't want them to have to deal with this issue, if you want, then you have to, you can't, it's all intertwined, it's all interconnected. You can't erase your problems, and unfortunately, when it comes to financial equity, sometimes, especially people, that make higher incomes and have more resources, it's hard for them to see this. But if COVID-19 or anything else we've been going through in the last 2 years hasn't proven anything else, you see just how I think some people were made to realize just, you're not invincible, you're not vulnerable, you are vulnerable to, all these different problems, the overarching problem, of systemic racism when it goes on in our community. So like I said, I'm not really giving, probably the most articulate, solution or detailed solution. That's probably a better way to put it. But I know that though. I know that, people become tapped in when they're faced with, whether it's the particular problem that affects your community or some kind of variation from it, then you have their attention, so. And it's kind of, to be honest, like I remember, before I created my company, working, more in the criminal justice reform and voting rights space, and like going to some of these strategy meetings, some of the things I suggest is like, hey, we can't really, we can't when we engage different communities, we have to speak to what pulls at their heartstrings or what they care about and connect it to our issues, because it's kind of hard to sell somebody on something that they're so far removed from. So in particular, more specifically, talking about criminal justice reform, I suggest like, hey, I'm gonna be honest with you. It's hard to get people from other communities to really tap into this issue when they don't know anyone that's incarcerated. It doesn't affect their family. It doesn't affect their friends. It doesn't affect their overall community. So to me, that's, I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but you have to find something that either pulls at somebody's heartstrings or pulls at their numbers, their bank account. That's when you wake people up.
I think that's actually a really great answer, right? Because there's actually two bottom lines. It's the emotional bottom line, and then it's the wallet bottom line. And sometimes you have to hit both, but sometimes you don't necessarily have to hit both. You just have to figure out which one is the more effective one to kind of poke at, to then get them to the other one. Of course, we need both, but we can determine the starting point of which one we hit, kind of go at first to address this, and then tie that into the other, whether it's emotional to financial or financial to emotional. But it's actually two pathways there then, right? And then, and of course, the cognitive, the logical one as well, which is where the data comes in and all of that. But this has been so amazing, Shaun. Thank you so much. I am so grateful that you took the time to do this for our summit and that you did this amazing job with this improv. And then for anybody who is still here, I will be back in just about 2 minutes with my closing thoughts on this. And then we do have our Clubhouse room tonight. I have pinned the link to this, the chat on Hopin, so that anybody who is not already a part of the Clubhouse, who doesn't know the link can get it. So Shaun, I will see you on stage in just a minute.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again so much. And when you get on stage, you'll see all of the comments about yours.
Okay.
All right. So we'll be back in just about a minute. Hang tight, everyone. Thank you all. And with that, we are done with this session and moving on to the closing remarks. See you soon.